to a new episode of our NUTRINSIGHTS Series. My name is Álvaro Guzman, and I am part of the editorial team at NutriNews International. And on behalf of our channel, I'm excited to welcome today's guest, Dr. Aline Remus, whom is a researcher at Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. And she's based at the Sherbrooke Research and Development Center. Dr. Remus brings extensive expertise in swine nutrition with a special focus on precision feeding. So it's quite an interesting topic, and we're thrilled to have her with us. So Dr. Remus, welcome, and thank you for accepting this invitation to be a part of this series.
Thank you, Alvaro, and the whole NutriNews team for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
That's awesome. So before we jump in, I would just wanted to ask you if you wouldn't mind giving us a brief overview of your background and how you reached your current position at Sherbrooke, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm originally from Brazil. So I did my bachelor in animal science at Santa Maria University in the south of Brazil. And when I was in the last semester of my animal science course, we could do like an internship. And I then went to São Paulo State University to do an internship in precision feeding because I already knew a little bit about the concept. I knew Dr. Pomar, and then I thought that was a great opportunity to learn more about the concept and the practice of it with Dr. Hauschild at São Paulo State University. And sure enough, I fell in love with it, and I stayed for a master at São Paulo. Met also Dr. Pomar there because he is also associated to São Paulo University. So we start to exchange on the project and my master, and they invite me to come to Canada and do a PhD here. So I did a dual degree. I did my PhD in UNESP in São Paulo, but also here at Laval University. And during all this time, during my PhD, I did all my experiments in precision feeding here at Sherbrooke Research Center. Once I finished my PhD, I went on to do a postdoc at Sherbrooke University. And in 2020, I was offered a junior research here, and 2 years ago I was hired as a full researcher, permanent researcher at the research center, and I'm actually replacing Dr. Pomar. So and now it has been 10 years that I've been working with individual precision feeding, and every day learning new things, and I really enjoy working in this area. It's full of new things for us to learn. We have a little bit of the impression that we know everything in nutrition, but when we work with precision feeding, you learn that you need to relearn all the basic concepts. So it's a little bit what I have been doing here.
That's pretty amazing and pretty interesting path, and a lot of experience on precision feeding. So that suits us very well for the topic we will be touching on today. So that's pretty nice. So jumping into some of our first questions. More on a broad spectrum, what are some of the key environmental challenges associated with pig production, and why is it important to take this into account from the producers or the industry point of view, if you would like, and also from a research perspective?
Sure. I think the most well-known environmental challenge that we associate with, especially growing finishing operations, is the excess of nitrogen and phosphorus that we find in manure. Because often we use manure to spread in the field and fertilize crops, right? And many regions will have problems with or the excess of phosphorus or nitrogen, or sometimes both, right? And this excess of nitrogen and phosphorus can lead to the runoff into water bodies, causing eutrophication, algal blooms, water contamination, and also the acidification of the soil. And in a more broader aspect, as any other production, pig production is also related to greenhouse emissions, because as any activity, as any human activity, will produce CO2, right? But of course, there is the methane and the nitrogen oxide from the manure of the pigs. That is something that we need to address. And the carbon dioxide that comes from ingredient and feed transportation and animal transportation. It's extremely important that we address the nitrogen and phosphorus part, because often when we are talking about environmental challenge, we focus a lot in greenhouse gas emissions, and we forget a little bit about eutrophication and acidification. But in highly dense pig population areas is actually the biggest problems that we have, right? The algal blooms and the acidification of soil. So decreasing this excess of nutrients can not only be environmentally good, like it not only brings a good response to environmental problem, but also can be benefic in terms of production costs, because what we have seen so far is often when we manage to decrease nitrogen and phosphorus in the diets, and then therefore in the manure, we also decrease production costs. So that is an extra benefit, right? I think it's something that we can all relate, not only what is extremely important, that is decrease our environmental footprint, but also that we see the side of the producers, which already face so many challenges, right, in this unstable economy. So that's a little bit what we have been looking for, nutritional solutions that can address both points.
Yeah, that's a great point, and I think it's something to keep in mind and to put up there in the list. Like, we have to make it economically sustainable for the producer as well, right? Because if not, we can have many proposed solutions, but if it's not feasible for the producer, things won't be implemented. So I think we have to look for that win-win situation, if you'd like to look at it like that. And I think it's a great point. So jumping into that and into finding those solutions from the nutrition side of things, and you've done quite a lot of research on individual precision feeding, which I think, and you've stated in some of your most recent publications, is a great way to try to assess this problem. So looking into this, how does individual precision feeding differ from conventional group-based feeding systems, and what are some of the main advantages of this type of feeding?
So normally we characterize our conventional group-based feeding as the practice that we normally use in the industry, right? We increase the number of feeds that are given overall the growing and finishing period to try and decrease that gap between what is required by the animal and what we're providing in the diet. In group feeding, all the pigs of the group will receive the same feed regardless of their individual nutrient needs. And this approach does exceeds in nutrients during growth, because the nutrient requirements not only change over time, but among animals. So when we're providing one standard diet for a group of animals that have different requirements, some animals will receive more nutrients than they need, and other animals will receive less. And often this excess is what will contribute to the excess of phosphorus and nitrogen that we see, right? And we tend to actually provide richer diets to provide the animals with nutrients above the requirement, because when we're doing that, we don't see any losses in performance. But when we try and decrease this security margin, we often will see some problems in terms of growth performance. In individual precision feeding, we try to give a more tailored solution in that case, because each pig receives a customized daily tailored diet, and is specific to his own growth stage. Actually is specific for the day of their growth. So based on their daily body weight and daily feed intake, we calculate how much nutrients they will need, and then we adjust this feed in real time for each one of the animals using automated feeding systems that track individual pig performance.
Okay, that's a great explanation of how precision feeding and individual precision feeding works. And coupling it and going back a little bit to the environmental challenges, and there's a concept that's very important. It's the life cycle assessment. Could you briefly give us a definition of what it is, or why is it important to evaluate the environmental impact of feeding systems, of course, like individual precision feeding, but in general, like we can use it in any type of feeding system. So could you give us a little more info on that?
Sure. So when we're talking about life cycle assessment, we often will hear the term LCA, says that this assessment. The idea of the LCA is to have a broader view of the system, so a more holistic system, not only look to a specific part of the production, but the system as a whole, right? So the LCA helps to evaluate the environmental impact from the different, in our case, different feeding systems, but any actually feeding strategy that you want to try in the animals, because the fact that you're reducing something like, let's say, crude protein in the diet, you might have a positive impact in one thing, like I don't know, eutrophication, right, or the amount of nitrogen, but not necessarily you decrease greenhouse emission as a whole, right? So the LCA help us to quantify this different process, the key environmental indicators that are, for example, greenhouse gas emissions that are calculated as CO2 equivalent, carbon dioxide equivalent. But also eutrophication that comes from nutrient pollution, so eutrophication, acidification, but you also can quantify resource use. You can see land change, water, energy, all these things. So you really see not only what you're changing in terms of your feeding system, like, for example, let's say that you want to compare group precision feeding to individual precision feeding. You're not only quantifying how much nitrogen the animals are excreting less, but you're also looking, okay, how much less CO2 is needed in terms of crop production and inputs, or by the change in the feeds, how change this crop impact and all that. So you try and see the system as a whole. There is other modeling approaches, but I think the LCA is probably the most famous and now has been broadly used by different companies. Almost everyone right now want to know what their impact they're doing LCAs. And I think although there is several limitations linked to LCA and any other model, I think it does give us a good indication of the direction we should be taking and how changes we do in the system affects so many other things that we could even sometimes not imagine. So it's a very nice holistic approach.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's a very important tool, and as you say, it might have its limitations, but I think it's a must. And I think having it more generally implemented is very important, right, for any livestock operation. So yeah, thank you for expanding on it and letting our audience have a better idea of what it means. So, and going back, you mentioned about some of the environmental challenges. We talked about acidification potential, eutrophication, and as well as the global warming potential. So how does IPF, or individual precision feeding, generate important reductions in terms of these challenges compared to conventional feeding systems?
Yeah, so at the time, my master's student, now she's my PhD student, but at the time she was my master's student, Berta Llorens. She actually did this study, and we use Quebec, this province of Canada, in the east of Canada, as a scenario to compare group to precision feeding. And we have seen that applying individual precision feeding during just the grow and finishing phase, without adding, for example, we could have done individual precision feeding for the sows and gestating sows, right? But we want to isolate just grow and finishing phase effect. We saw that we could decrease global warming potential in CO2 equivalent and carbon equivalent by 8% when we use precision feeding. And more important results in terms of acidification, we saw 16% reduction in acidification and 13% in eutrophication. So it's a major result, because every time that we're looking for potentials to decrease CO2 in pig production, which is already not a major CO2 producer, right? If you compare to other productions, you see that actually pork meat has a lower impact already, because it's such an optimized production. So to go and manage to decrease further CO2 emission is very hard in this system. So we're very happy to see that we could get, in our scenario, an 8% reduction. And this happens basically because precision feeding optimizes the nutrient efficiency. So when we increase protein efficiency of utilization, amino acid efficiency of utilization, phosphorus efficiency of utilization, we're then decreasing the excretion, which will then, of course, play a role in how much is going to the manure, how much methane then is being produced in that manure, and so on, right? So by making the pigs more efficient nutrient-wise is how we manage to get such good reductions in environmental impacts.
Yeah, that's very interesting, and it's very nice to be able to quantify and show those results, because at the end of the day, that shows that it works, right? And that's what we're looking for. And as you say, in such an optimized type of production as is swine production, be able to achieve that is like, wow. So that's pretty interesting. And it's definitely worth looking into this alternative, right? And trying to make it more widespread, if you'd like. And following up on this, like, how much does the choice of feed ingredients, let's say, for example, corn or soybean meal, influence that environmental footprint in pig production?
Yeah, I'll have to say that this is the impacts that I'll talk will be very specific for our scenario. Mm-hmm. And will vary, of course, depending on the scenario that we use. But the choice of the ingredient was the major player for us in terms of environmental impact. Actually, was the feed, the crop production that account for the most of the environmental impact that we have, right? So what we have seen is, in our scenario, the Quebec, which is cold, which means during the winter, we have very little losses in the lagoon from the manure, because basically the fermentation stops. So you have to consider that when you look to those numbers, right? And what also happens is, or corn is not as productive as, for example, I want to say the Midwest of the United States. So these losses in production of some crops will then account, like, every time that you make something a little bit less efficient, you end up producing a little bit more environmental impact, at least in the way we have seen, like less optimization. So also, before I go to details, I want to characterize the scenario, because if I don't, it's very easy to say, well, it's generalized, right? So our scenario is very specific. We're talking about a scenario where the crops are produced in our region within a 200 kilometers range between where the crops are produced, transport to the feed mill, and then from the feed mill to the swine installations. And then we have also a short transportation. We're talking 50, 60 kilometers between where we have the weaning to the growing finishing station. So we characterize a densely populated region of Quebec that is La Bosse, which is is a region that is a fair normal scenario that we would encounter in our province. So when we do that, we have noticed that actually corn, for our surprise, was the crop that was contributing the most for global warming and acidification. And every time that we had a diet that was rich in corn, especially when you're talking about precision feeding, we only use two feeds. One that is dense in nutrients, we call it feed A, so it's very rich in nutrients. And then we will have inclusion normally of corn, soybean, and we're talking there an inclusion of 30-40% soybean meal. And the rest will be corn, and we do use a little bit of wheat, 10-15% of wheat. And our feed B is then nutritionally poor in sense of not dense. It's not that it's a bad diet, it's just not dense in nutrients. We're talking about a lysine concentration of 0.30%, which is basically corn. So our diet B is corn. So every time that we're changing these nutrients, if we increase the soybean meal, we would see more potential of eutrophication increasing. And when we increased corn, we would increase acidification. And when we look at the conventional phase feeding, we would see the same results. Corn and then followed by wheat were potential problem crops, which is very surprising. If you look at any other LCA in Europe, for instance, or you see that normally soybean meal is the crop that is the problem for this. And it's why I want to highlight so much how it's important that the solutions be taken for different scenarios and how the scenarios can be extremely different between countries. And even when we're within a country, if we compare our scenario here in Quebec with the west of Canada, is not the same, because there we're going to have much more wheat get into the diet. We're going to have much more canola instead of soybean, and these crops will change the impact, right? So it's extremely important to characterize the different scenarios and to see how the different crops that are used in the diets are affecting those problems. So in our case, we have seen that we have to find alternative ingredients for corn and wheat. We have to find a source of energies that can help us to decrease this problem. And these impacts are highly linked to the productivity of the crops. So depending how much are the inputs that are going to the field versus how much crop you're producing in a certain area will then change those results. Yeah, I know it's very technical, but it's but I think it's important.
It's very interesting, and I think it's a point that we have to keep in mind, right? Because a lot of times we want to take something that works or that seems very good and generalize it and think that we can apply it everywhere. And it's important to understand that we have to think in the context where we stand with the ingredients we're dealing, where we're sourcing them from. It's very important so that we're making a good assessment, right? Both from the economic standpoint and as well as the environmental challenges that's generating. Because if not, it's like we can't reproduce something that works in Quebec, I don't know, in Brazil, for example, or the other way around. Yeah. So it's important to understand that. And I think you make a great point. And you actually give me the perfect point to follow up on this in terms of what works in one region might not work in the other. So do you believe a feeding system like individual precision feeding can work in other parts of the world? What are some of the environmental and economic benefits? You already mentioned some of them that we have to keep in mind or that should encourage producers to implement it, but also being mindful that what works somewhere might not work exactly the same somewhere else, but is it still worth considering it?
Yes. So I think just to pick up back on that, I think the problem crop will be different, but the benefit of the system will translate to other regions. I think the key point is really like, you cannot assume that crop, like that corn will be your ingredient problem or that soybean meal will be your ingredient problem. You really need to, as you said, you need to look at your region specifically and see what is your problem and how you can tackle that by changing your formulation accordingly. But in terms of the precision feeding itself compared to the phase feeding, the magnitude of how big will be the advantage will depend a lot in your phase feeding system, how many phases you have, how much is the gap between the nutrients that are being provided versus what is excreted. So if you already have a phase feeding system that is extremely well optimized, and we're talking, I don't know, 10 phase feedings, which is not common in some places, but there is Brazil, you see them doing when to finish is 10 phases. And then this excess will be a bit lower, right?
Mm-hmm.
But you have CO2 produced by transportation. So you always have something different. And it's why I say you have to access how much will be the benefit depending on your scenario. But Inês Andretta actually did an LCA in Brazil to see what would be. And she have shown that whether you're sourcing your ingredients from the Central East of Brazil or the South of Brazil, it will change the impact on how much is the crop problem and which is the crop problem. But she found very similar results in terms of climate change. So every time she applied precision feeding, she would at least decrease the potential climate change, the global warming, by 6%. And the eutrophication and acidification, she found 5%. So you see again that depending what you're using, how your crops are produced, that magnitude will be different. If you look in France, which soybean meal is a bit of a problem, they are talking about decreasing acidification by 7%, and eutrophication, or vice versa. Don't have the numbers exactly in my head, but they're talking about 7 to 10%, 13% again. They change land use. That's very important. For example, in France, we will change land occupation, and again, precision feeding will decrease climate change by 6%. So it does translate to others. It's just the magnitude of this impact will depend a lot of your system and what you're comparing to. But even if you look for, there is another study in the Netherlands, and you see that they also pointed to precise technologies as a way to decrease climate change. So I do think it translates. It's just the magnitude will be different.
Yeah, that's a great point. And as you say, like, the system in itself provides a lot of benefits. It just depends on the magnitude if you want to look at it, but it's still worth considering, right? And if we look into the economical impact of it, would you say it's worth giving it a thought from the producer's side of things?
So from what we calculated, along with some partners, is that we can, for the feed meal, we see a 2% reduction in cost from moving to do 3-phase feeding, for example, to do just 2 feeds. That is the principle of the individual precision feeding, moving just to 2 feeds that you can blend and then provide the animals with tailored diets. So this is a 2% reduced for the feed meal. Now, if the feed meal is doing more feeds, probably this amount in saving costs in producing so many different feeds will be different. For the producers, we are talking in a reduction in cost of 10 to 12% in feed costs. So at the time where feed was way cheaper than it is today, we're talking about $8 to $12 per pigs in our trials. But we're now doing some new trials, and we want to recalculate this for a broader number of animals and a bit different scenarios. But I think that the number we have repeated in 3 trials, and this 10% feed reduction has been consistent in the trials. There is other benefits that are not only related to the direct cost. Precision feeding offers some other advantages like automation. We have a huge problem in terms of workforce. So if we can somehow have an equipment that is not out of your mind expensive, that is something that the producer can afford, that lasts, that is consistent, and then can help the producer to reduce the amount of workforce. I think that is a benefit that we never calculate, how much actually it would be in revenue and how much workforce would really reduced, but I think it's something that you have to keep in mind because it's a more and more recurrent problem. And also, as we have feed intake in real time, we normally can see, we can detect a change in feed intake 2 to 3 days before we see any clinical signs of disease, because the first thing that changes is not only the amount that the animals eat, but the way these animals are eating, right? How many times they go to the feeder and so on. So I think that could be an added benefit if we can do it like to detect early, because many of times what happened is we detect that the animals are sick when you have many animals in your group that are sick, and it's almost too late to actually have any saving. You have really enter with drastic measures. So you have losses in performance, you have costs in antibiotics and vets costs and so on. If you can do early disease detection, you can not only isolate that animal and try to avoid that spreads, but you can personalize the feed and help these animals to recover. There is many research coming out showing that functional amino acids can help the animals during a challenge. Then Columbo's lab have been showing that, Luciano Hauschat's lab have been showing that. So if we can tailor the diet for the animals in that difficult period, we can also probably have some added benefits there. Yes, we have costs, but probably if you calculate that, you could have a potential return on investment.
Yeah, that's something that maybe we don't think about it specifically because we just stay on the nutrition side of things, but all of the technology that can be implemented to coupled with these systems allows us to take decisions and management wise much faster than we are able to do so right now. And that reduces a lot of costs, as you mentioned, and it makes things much more efficient, right? So yeah, I think the potential is huge.
Yeah, and if you think today when we send the animals to the market, we send normally according to the weight, right? It's not all places that do all in, all out, right? You have people that will have to have groups of animals going and some will stay. So if we can do with multi-phase feeding or individual precision feeding, when I say multi-phase feeding, I mean group precision feeding. If we can improve the heterogeneity of this herd by better feeding these animals, especially in those light pigs, and we could save in time to market. Imagine you saving 3-4 days in time to market. That is also probably an added benefit there that we didn't account for in this 10 to 12% savings.
Yeah, so it's a lot more when you put it into perspective, and hopefully those new studies will shed light on this and bring more attention to it. So we're looking forward to that. Right. And to wrap it up, I would like to get your final thoughts on where do you see the future of sustainable livestock production, if you want to put it that way, going, particularly focusing on the implementation of technology and systems like precision feeding or individual precision feeding, and what might be some of the biggest challenges in implementing these types of systems moving forward, and what would you think we can do to address those or to make it more widespread in the industry?
Yeah, so I think so far there is, the way I see there is 2 limitants to the implementation in commercial farms of individual precision feeding. And I'll make a difference between group precision feeding, where we feed the pen according to the requirement, and individual precision feeding. Today we have the equipment available for group precision feeding. We can feed the pen. And I think for many, many years, the big limitant for the implementation was to have equipment. Now we start to see these equipments to become available for a group, and soon enough we will have individual feeders to do individual precision feeding at a cost, accessible cost. I'm not talking, we have today some, but we know that they're still just viable in experimental units, right? Mm-hmm. But we'll come to that. I think very soon we'll have this equipment available and easy to use. So one of the barriers was that equipment. I don't think equipment and technology are the problem anymore. We're advancing much faster, and I think the pandemic was actually a turning point in terms of like making technology available in farms. I think the second point is training. You need trained people to do individual precision feeding. You need trained people to do group precision feeding. So I think another limitant has been training and how we can make this available. So from our side, for example, in the cluster project, we plan to put together a workshop for nutritionists, producers, industry, so that they can come and play with the model and learn a little bit more and practice how you can do. And I think this type of initiative is still missing because it's very difficult to implement in a farm if people are not sure how to take. So I think this is a little bit of what has been limited. How I see that is a little bit that is also missing is this making this whole system simple to adopt. Is not the producer that will be changing the diet every day, right? I do see like consultancy companies playing a huge role, the big nutrition companies and how they can play a role there, helping the producer in this step, because otherwise we're going to drown the producer with technology and data, and then that will not be useful. So I think trained people will be a thing. I do see first group precision feeding become a reality because the technology is available. And I think once people get there, they want to move to individual precision feeding because they will see the benefits and they say, well, I can do so much more with individual precision feeding. But also I see it being implemented for different producers in different ways, right? I think there is producers that are able and ready to go to a more refined individual system, while there are other producers that for them group precision feeding will be what they'll be doing and will work for them. So I do not believe the systems will be implemented equally all across. I think will really depend in the objectives and the abilities that you have in the different sectors.
Yeah, that's some very interesting insight, and I think it's very important, and I think it's the beauty of it as well, right? The tailor-made approach, and it can be implemented in so many ways and bring benefits on an individual level for the producer, but as well on a more generalizable level. So yeah, it's not so much a matter of the technology not being there. It's more a matter of how do we bring that to the producers, to the industry. How do we make it accessible? And that education part of it is also very important. And we have to have someone willing to provide that training as well, right? To make it more accessible. Because if not, we're always, we can try to scale it down cost-wise, but people have to understand how to use it, right? And why is it beneficial? So that's a great point. And I would really like to thank you again for your time. It's been quite an interesting talk, and I hope we can have you back on the show soon, shedding some more light on this and where are things progressing. So thank you again, Dr. Remus, and on behalf of our channel, I would like to thank you, and I think on behalf of our audience as well. It's been very interesting.
Thank you and all your team for the invite, and it's always a pleasure to be here with you in NutriNews.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, and hope to see you soon. Bye.